Oh.
All right.
Well, thanks everyone for coming to our policy lunch for the Salem Center. We're very, very happy to have Dr. Gad Said here today. He's professor of marketing at Concordia University and research chair in evolutionary behavioral sciences and Darwinian consumption. So he's a behavioral psychologist and in a business school, so that's exciting for us. And we'll be talking today on the method of evolutionary psychology and its applicability to consumer research. So this area, and I hope all of you can join us this evening at 5 p.m. In Rowling Hall in the Crum Auditorium, where he'll be delivering a talk on his best-selling book, The Parasitic Mind. So thank you very much for coming down.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Carlos, and the rest of the folks who made this possible. And it's great to see David West here, who was one of my early heroes in evolutionary psychology. In 2001, I gave a talk at University College London at an evolution conference, and David was there, and many of the other pioneers of evolutionary psychology. And so one of my great memories from academia is actually that day meeting all of them, and they all had lovely things to say. So thank you, David, for that day, and it's so great to see you again. So today what I'd like to do is explain the epistemology of evolutionary thinking. And the reason why I was compelled to, this stems from a paper that I wrote in 2017. The reason why I was compelled to write that paper is because of all of the critiques and attacks that I've been exposed to as an evolutionary behavioral scientist, and certainly as David would agree with. The attack that I find most galling is when people say that evolutionary psychology is just so storytelling, right? We sit around, sipping cognac, smoking a pipe, and just coming up with these fanciful stories that are completely unfalsifiable. They're completely post hoc and speculative. And hopefully that when you finish listening to this talk, it will maybe, address that concern for you. Why am I unable to move it? It's not.
You say it's on the slides again.
Say again?
Give them the slides again.
Try.
Yeah. Click there in the slide, on top of the slide.
Here. By the way, since we're
Hey, right.
pause, we are going to hold questions till the end. There we go.
So it's working on?
Yep.
Okay, good. So one of the things I like to do is just to give a quick story of how I was first introduced to evolutionary psychology, and I think David has a similar story, although several years earlier. My first exposure to EP comes from this guy. I did my PhD at Cornell, and I had taken an advanced social psychology course. This gentleman's name is Dennis Regan. And about halfway through the course, even though this was not an evolutionary psychology course, it was a social psychology course, he assigned this book by two husband and wife team. They used to be, actually, proud to say they were at a Canadian-based school at McMaster. The book is titled Homicide. I highly recommend that you all read it. It's still a classic. In the book, they look at patterns of criminality via an evolutionary lens. And when I saw the elegance, the explanatory elegance, the parsimony that was afforded via this evolutionary lens, where with one elegant explanation, they can explain a myriad of dreadful realities. For example, the number one predictor of there being child abuse in a home. Social scientists have come up with 100 different predictors. The number one, that's something like, I think, 100-fold greater predictor than anything else, is if there's a step-parent in the home. And there are very clear evolutionary reasons why that might be the case. This has become known as the Cinderella effect. Who's the number one most dangerous person in a woman's life? It's not a serial rapist, hiding in the bushes. It's typically her husband. For what reason is he driven to homicidal rage? It's because suspected or realized infidelity. Paternity uncertainty is a severe problem to a man's genetic interest, and therefore, not that you're justifying, not that you're condoning those behaviors. That's another thing that people hate about evolutionary psychology. if you offer an evolutionary explanation for a reprehensible behavior, then people get angry at you. Or are you saying, therefore, science says it's okay to abuse your stepchildren? Of course, you're not saying that. That's like arguing that, you know, a dermatologist who studies melanoma is justifying, you know, skin cancer, right? You're not. So that's how I originally got excited about evolutionary psychology. Now, I was very interested in studying behavioral decision-making and studying consumer decision-making. And so that's eventually what led me to then develop the field of evolutionary consumption, applying the evolutionary lens to study consumer behavior. And consumer behavior, defined very broadly, it's not just, you know, consuming Coca-Cola and Starbucks. We consume religion, we consume popular culture, we consume friendships. So, you know, you could pretty much fit anything under the, you know, the umbrella of consumption. All right, just to kind of excite you about some of the empirical studies that I've done applying evolutionary principles in consumer behavior, and then I'll get into the epistemology of EP. Here's a study that got a lot of, I mean, both scientific attention, but also media attention, and I think you'll see in a second why. This is, of course, the classic, you know, form of sexual signaling. Here's the peacock who's demonstrating to the peahen, look, despite all of this burdensome tail, which makes it more difficult for me to survive, it makes me more visible to predators, it makes me less likely to, you know, fly away, I'm still standing here. So it's a costly signal, it's an honest signal of my quality. Shouldn't you choose me? It's a big advertisement. So then basically I take some of these principles and I say, well, can we find such principles in consumer behavior? Well, of course, you know, the fancy sports car, almost exclusively driven by or purchased by men around the world, even though innumerable women are certainly powerful enough and wealthy enough to buy any car that they want, they don't buy enough to do so, because that is a sexual signal that men use to impress women. Now, it's not that women also don't engage in sexual signaling, which I'll show in the next slide. But in this case, what we did, this is one of my former students, John Bungus, who's now a professor at Ithaca College. We brought men, this wasn't, in many psychology studies, it's imagine that you were doing this. In this case, we actually rented a Porsche. And I always tell people, probably the most impressive thing in this study was not the study, but rather to convince someone to release grant money for us to rent a Porsche for scientific purposes, literally. And so we rented a Porsche, and we got the beaten up old car, and we had men come into the lab, and they drove both cars. So it's within subject design, they drove both cars, either on a semi-deserted highway or in a downtown area in Montreal on the weekend where everybody can see you. This is called lekking behavior from zoology. A lek is a physical space, typically where males go and, you know, show off their feathers, and then the females kind of choose, right? And the dependent measure here was a hormonal measure. It was testosterone as measured through salivary assays. One of the reasons why I wanted to do these types of studies is because it made it a lot more difficult to argue that, oh, but it's just due to socialization and so on. Once you get into physiological measures, some of the imbecility kind of, you know, flies away. And not surprisingly, what we found, I mean, there were many things in the study. I'm just going to give you a quick, you know, rundown of the main study. One of the main findings: you put men in this car, their endocrinological system explodes. Basically, their testosterone levels go very high. Right? Probably all of you could have predicted this, but we certainly demonstrated it. Just to stay on the topic of fancy cars, this is a study that regrettably I've yet to publish, and I'm very regretful. You know, you always have a stack of, you know, projects that you've never gotten to. Well, this is one of those that I regret the most, because I truly think it's both scientifically, you know, nicely designed, but also, you know, one of those kind of cool, sexy studies. So we created two, you know, personal ads, you know, for dating apps and so on. Everything is exactly the same, except that this, you know, my favorite possession is either this car or this car, right? And then we asked people, both men and women, to evaluate this guy. Now, there are many different dependent measures that we looked at, but I'll just point to one today. We asked people, how tall do you think this guy is? And we asked that of men, and we asked that of women. Now, how did I get the idea for that study? It comes from another study, not mine, where here's what happened. You bring a guy into a room and you introduce him to the class, and you just alter his academic status. In one version, he's a postdoc. In one version, he's an assistant professor. In one version, he's a full professor. He doesn't change magically, right? But what happens is, as my academic status goes up, I suddenly become taller. This is why I tell my wife she doesn't have to regret that she is with someone who is not 6 feet tall, because based on academic status, I'm 7'2". So she can still feel happy. I'm even taller than David Buss. I mean, not academically, but in terms of you're 6'4", 6. There you go. So I was able to find a compensatory process for my lacking height. Now, here's the interesting thing about this study, if that weren't interesting enough. When women evaluate the guy in the Porsche, he magically becomes taller. When men evaluate the guy in the Porsche, he magically becomes shorter. So we call this the status elongation and status contraction effect, right? Our perceptual biases are structured in this case in a sex-specific way, where if I'm a woman and I see a guy that appears to be exuding cues of high status, he becomes taller. When I'm a man and I see another guy who appears to be threatening to me, then I need to derogate him. Oh, what is this little short guy? He probably is trying to compensate for lacking traits. Now, just so that you don't think that I only study, male sexual signaling, this is a study. Now, there's been many studies since, but we certainly were amongst the earliest ones to do it in a consumer behavior setting. This is one of my other former graduate students, who's now a chaired professor at Miami University of Ohio, Eric Stenstrom. So here what you have, what is this? Anybody recognize what this is?
Chimp.
Yes, and what specifically? What am I? Sorry?
I was going to say bonobos, but I'm not sure if they're chimps.
This is a female chimp, and she is an estrus, so her genitalia is engorged. Now, of course, you see this homologous reality across many species, including in humans, but perhaps fortunately, women are not quite as conspicuous in demonstrating their receptivity. But what we argued, of course, is that they will engage in certain behaviors, consumer relevant behaviors, that when they are in the maximally fertile phase of their menstrual cycles, they're more likely to engage in beautification practices. Maybe wear the 6-inch stilettos, maybe be more scantily clad, maybe wear makeup and so on. And that's exactly what we found. Now, what is another unique feature of our study is that many menstrual cycle studies usually look at 2 time periods, either luteal phase or fertile phase. Whereas in our case, we actually collected data from every single day across 35 days, so that it was a lot more granular. And the reason why it's 35 days, by the way, is because the average menstrual cycle is about 28 days. So then you're covering most women. And therefore we had much more granular data that we could then analyze. And so this gives you a sense of some of the empirical studies. I mean, there are many others, of course, that I've done in my career, but it gives you a sense of some of the things that we can do when we're applying an evolutionary lens. Now, it's not a coincidence that it took someone who is steeped in evolutionary thinking to have come up with these studies, because otherwise, why would you ever propose such a research question? If everything is due to socialization and culture and advertising and your peers, not that these things don't matter, but if you never recognize that, maybe humans in general and consumers in particular might be biological beings shaped by hormones, for example, then you'll never come up with these types of studies. So that's just to kind of whet your appetite about some of the empirical things that one can do, trying to marry evolutionary thinking with consumer behavior. So I started this, pretty much straight out of my PhD, so almost 30 years now. I saw endless kinds of canards and, anger and, desk rejection. And of course, my very highly esteemed colleague, David Buss, would probably have another 50 such stories where people would have this very, very hostile reaction to the idea that, what do you mean biology matters? Look, I talk about this actually in the Parasitic Mind, the talk that I'll be giving tonight. I gave 2 talks at the University of Michigan when my first book came out. The first book was on, evolutionary consumption. One psychology department on Thursday. The other talk was Friday, the exact same talk in the business school. I give the talk in the psychology department, and this is a very prestigious department, one of the top departments in the world. It goes perfect. I'm like, wow, this is beautiful. We love you. I give the exact same talk the next day. I couldn't get through 1/3 of the slides. I've never experienced that level of hostility from an academic crowd. Why? Because the business school folks at the time, a bit less now, but not so much better, couldn't believe the nonsense I was spewing. What do you mean applying? Biology matters for the mosquito. Biology matters for the zebra. It matters for your dog. But surely you're not saying, Professor Saad, that it matters for consumers. Are you saying that consumers are animals? Yes, I am saying that. We don't somehow exist in a supraplane whereby we abdicate the role of biology. So the typical things that you get, there are many more of these. Biological instincts are not relevant to humans. We are mainly a cultural animal. Evolutionary psychology promotes, encourages, justifies, condones all kinds of reprehensible behavior. I already alluded to this. This is one that you always get, even from colleagues, right? Here's a sexual dimorphism. Men are bigger than women. They're taller, they weigh more. But Professor Saad, my Aunt Linda is taller than my Uncle Joe, so your Darwinian stuff is bullshit. Oh, goddamn. Out goes Darwin, you've proven us wrong. So anything that I say, someone can argue, here is a manifestation, right? Humans are a sexually reproducing species, but they are asexual people. They are celibate priests. Therefore it's false. There's homosexuality, exclusive homosexuality. So there's this cognitive bias whereby if you identify an individual datum that appears to falsify something that's true at the population level, then we're dead. It's finished. EP is a bunch of nonsense. And the one that upsets me the most, which will be the context for the rest of my talk, is evolutionary psychology largely consists of unfalsifiable, unprovable, untestable, speculative nonsense. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, the opposite holds true, as I will show you in this talk. Okay, so the epistemology, so now we get into a lot more of the technical stuff. So the epistemology of EP. I argue it's made up of 3 important elements. First, the epistemological distinction between proximate and ultimate explanations. I'll explain what that is. Nomological networks of cumulative evidence. It's something that not only I've covered this in my evolutionary psychology work, but also in chapter 7 of the Parasitic Mind, I have a whole chapter on exactly that. And then evolutionary psychology or evolutionary theory allows us to generate consilient trees of knowledge, organized, coherent knowledge, rather than completely bifurcated, contradictory knowledge. And much of the rest of today's talk will deal with that. So let's begin with the first one. So now I'll do this one, then I'll cover this, and then this. Okay. So proximate and ultimate. This is one of those epistemological points that I hope people who are sitting in this crowd will one day say, oh, wow, this is the first time I've heard of this and it altered the way that I think. Just like the first time that I heard it, that's exactly how I reacted. Proximate explanations is where much of science lies. There's nothing wrong with it. It explains the how and the what of phenomena. So Raj is sitting here from the business school. Thank you for coming to, I wrote him to say, please come to the talk. So
I'm going to stop allowing you to go forward.
And this is, in a sense, a closer. Do you remember when I was supposed to come many years ago to give a talk here, but then I was stuck in Lubbock. I was giving a talk first in Lubbock, and I was stuck there because the state shut down, and I didn't know why. It turns out because there was like this severe weather pattern. When I looked out the window, there was about 1/4 of an inch of snow. I'm coming from Montreal, Canada. I didn't think that an entire state could be shut. So I ended up having to cancel a whole, but I was doing the whole Texas tour. I ended up being stuck in Lubbock for about almost a week, which, by the way, no disrespect to Lubbock. If you're going to be stuck somewhere, Lubbock is not the place to be. But anyways, so proximate explanations deal with the how and the what of a phenomenon. What are the factors that increase your likelihood of having diabetes? How does diabetes work? I mean, mechanistically in your body. So pretty much almost every Nobel Prize that's ever been won has been won for phenomena that were studied at the proximate level. That's great, that's wonderful, no problem. Ultimate explanations, and I realize that the word ultimate can be misconstrued because it seems as though it's ultimate, it's superior. That's not what it means. Ultimate means that when you unfold the causal chain of the explanation, it's the ultimate Darwinian why. Why did it evolve to be of that form? So to fully understand the phenomenon involving biological beings, we want to tackle the phenomenon at both the proximate and ultimate level. If you only tackle it at the proximate level, at best you have an incomplete explanation. At worst, you have incorrect explanations. Okay, so all of the research in, say, marketing or consumer behavior historically has been at the proximate level. No one had typically asked why, Darwinian why. Why did we evolve to engage in this type of sexual signaling? Okay. So the example that I love to use, which by the way, if you look here, Schmidt and Pilcher, David Schmidt is one of David Buss's former doctoral student. They built a fantastic nomological network to explain the evolutionary roots of pregnancy sickness. I'll talk about that in a second. So if you look at pregnancy sickness, right, there are all sorts of proximate questions I can ask. How do the hormonal changes of a woman affect the severity of her symptoms? That's a how question. And I could list you another 37,000 questions at the proximate level that deal with pregnancy sickness. The ultimate explanation for pregnancy sickness is just one question. Why have women evolved that physiological mechanism? Why have they evolved attraction to certain foods and repulsion from other foods during that time, that gestational period? And it turns out that you can set your clocks to when pregnancy sickness starts and when it ends. It happens during the first trimester. It happens during a period called organogenesis. The development of the organs in utero. During that time period, it is particularly important that the woman not be exposed to certain, ingestible pathogens, teratogens, and so on that can wreak havoc to that developmental process. Therefore, the whole cascade of phenomena that happen as part of pregnancy sickness are a form of insurance policy to protect the child. Now, what are some evidence that we have of that? Women who have greater pregnancy sickness symptoms are less likely to have a miscarriage. The trajectory of the childbirth is improved by having more pregnancy sickness. So then you might say, okay, well, that's a great scientific question, but who cares? What are the practical implications? Well, if you go see your OBGYN and you ask them, can you please help me with my severity? The intervention, the therapeutic intervention that they give you from an evolutionary perspective is the perfectly incorrect thing to do. Because those pills that you're going to take are meant to reduce your symptoms. Now, practically speaking, it makes sense in that if I have an exam tomorrow, I don't want to be running every 3 seconds to throw up in the bathroom. So it might make sense mechanistically for me to assuage my symptoms. But from an evolutionary sense, shutting off that insurance policy is not a good idea. Well, I've lectured on this exact example to MBA students who come from the healthcare world, surgeons, OBGYNs, physicians, and then they'll come up to me at the end of the presentation and say, hey, Professor Saad, we never learned this in medical school. Well, we didn't learn this in medical school because even physicians are trained in proximate world, not ultimate world. So one of our colleagues, I'm pointing to David again, Randy Nesse, who is a practicing psychiatrist, he's one of the pioneers of trying to infuse evolutionary thinking in the medical school, right? The idea is that even physicians are not well trained to think about the why of our bodies, right? And so, of course, what I've been doing for my entire career is trying to Darwinize the business school or, certain areas of the behavioral sciences, okay? So that's the proximate versus ultimate. So now if you remember here, I said that I will start with proximate versus ultimate, then I will go to this. Now this is truly one of those, I hope you don't mind me saying, it's truly one of those things that hopefully has a lasting impact on you if this is the first time you hear it. So a nomological network of cumulative evidence, it's a fancy term for something that Charles Darwin had done more than 150 years ago, which is what? He'd like to demonstrate that his theory of evolution is veridical. So what is he going to do? He's going to get data from paleontology and from comparative morphology and from animal husbandry and from geology, from many, many distinct lines of evidence, all of which, when they are triangulated, but they're not triangulated in a methodological sense, they're triangulated epistemologically, right? So what is the nomological network of cumulative evidence? I'm going to get you data from across cultures, across time periods, across animals in many cases, across disciplines, across frameworks, across dependent measures, all of which demonstrate that the phenomenon that I'm explaining is exactly correct in the way I'm explaining it to you. So imagine how powerful that tool is. It's not a literature review, right? A literature review is very, very narrow, right? What have people studied when it comes to coffee consumption and asthma symptoms? Let's do a literature review on that. This is much, much bigger. It says, what would be all possible data that I can generate in every possible conceivable way that demonstrates that what I'm telling you is true, right? So it's truly epistemologically liberating. It's precisely what allows me to walk into rooms. You guys don't seem at all to be hostile, but I can walk into rooms that are incredibly hostile, but I walk in with all of the swagger in the world. Well, one, maybe it's my personhood, but two, it's because I've already done my homework. I've already built the nomological network that says, if you want to debate me, you better have a network so I don't need to scream louder than you. I don't need to insult you. I don't need to be hysterical. I build you the nomological network, and then you'll be quiet. Okay, so let me show you such a network. So here's one. Men have an evolved preference for the hourglass figure in women. So, for example, I am unaware of, maybe David will confirm this, unless, of course, Margaret Mead were here, then she might say, no, but I know a culture where this doesn't hold true. There is no culture that I'm aware of where men recurringly and predictably prefer to mate with women who look like male Olympic swimmers. Okay? That preference doesn't exist. We can very, very clearly predict the exact body type that men from drastically different societies across time are going to prefer. And on average, it's the hourglass figure. As a matter of fact, we can exactly point to the morphological traits, as Devendra Singh, who used to be at UT Austin, had been one of, probably the pioneer of that work, the waist to hip ratio. It's roughly between 0.68 to 0.72. So now if I want to prove to you that there are very compelling evidence for that preference to be an evolutionary based preference, how would I go about doing that? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build for you that nomological network. I'm going to try to think of all possible data that would hopefully convince you that I'm on the right track. So let's look at something. Well, from medicine and fertility, we know that the hourglass figure has been shown to be a reliable cue, and then you could for fertility and health, right? As women get older, their waist to hip ratio worsens. If you're suffering from certain diseases, you're less likely to have a good waist to hip ratio. You're more likely to conceive if you have the right waist to hip ratio, and so on. So already, that's a very direct currency from a Darwinian perspective, but I'm not going to stop there. I could look at dependent measures spanning from many different, paradigms. For example, I could hook up people in an fMRI, or men. I could show them women of different waist to hip ratios, and I can show that their pleasure centers are more likely to light up when they see the hourglass. So here, I didn't ask you in a paper and pencil task, which one do you like? I literally went straight to your brain, right? So I can get you data from completely different cultures. I can go to the Yanomamo tribe and the Amazon, who have not been exposed to Western media images, and I can show you that they have the same preferences, right? And on and on and on. So for example, this is actually a study that I did back in 2008, where I had an undergraduate research assistant do a content analysis of advertisements of online female escorts from around the world. What does an online female escort do? Here is my waist here's my hips, here's my bust size, here's my height, here's my weight, call me. Okay? Now, it doesn't matter, by the way, if she's lying about those metrics. What matters is what she's advertising. That's what we care about. And it turns out across 48 different cultures that couldn't be any more different from each other, literally, it's as if you made up the data. It's exactly where you expect it to be. Okay? Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. Oh, let me just do two more. This is one from spanning thousands of years. You can get data from ancient Greece, from ancient African art, from Indian art, showing you that sculptures and statues, if you do an analysis of their waist to hip ratio, that they're meant to depict female beauty, are exactly those that you would expect. You can get, this is prehistoric Jomon figurines, and you get the exact same thing. And then the kicker, the one that should hopefully nail the proverbial nail in the coffin, look at this one. Congenitally blind men who have never had the gift of sight. So they couldn't have been socialized by Beyonce videos. They couldn't have been socialized by Elle magazine. It's not the evil patriarchy that socialized them. They're congenitally blind since birth. Using a haptic paradigm, you ask them to touch different mannequins. Oh, look, they picked the exact same one, right? So I got you data from different cultures, different backgrounds, different time periods, different methodologies, and I could have given you a lot more. Say, now, does this look like it's just so storytelling? Does this look like it's just unfalsifiable nonsense? As a matter of fact, it's very falsifiable. If you find a culture where men's preferences are not within a very narrow window, you have falsified the mechanism. So it's insane. It simply is it's a measure of you being an imbecile if you say, but evolution is just unfalsifiable gunk. By the way, when I went to University of Michigan, and you do the visit to each of the faculty members' offices, one faculty member, a professor of marketing, said to me, I know you're a very sharp guy. What is it that you're wasting your time studying this evolution stuff when we all know that evolution is an unfalsifiable thing? Oh, gee, so Charles Darwin is just a moron. You at the Ross School of Business are the super sharp guy, but the mechanism that explained biodiversity across every species, that's just unfalsifiable cognac sipping stuff. It's frustrating. Why? Because you would expect better from many of your social science colleagues, like the ones who are heading the top marketing journals. You don't get that. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to link this process of accumulating evidence to actually some of the stuff that I did in my doctoral dissertation. So bear with me, this is where it gets a tiny bit technical. So this is called a sequential decision-making model. In a sequential decision-making model, actually, since we have someone from stats, the origin of that comes from Abraham Wald, who is from statistical decision theory. So this is now we're entering my doctoral dissertation. So here what you have is you have two alternatives. This could be anything. It could be car A, car B. It could be woman A, woman B. It could be political candidate A, political candidate B. So you've already gone through a pruning process where you've gone from, let's say, 10 alternatives down to the final two, and now this model kicks in. What does this model say? It says that decision-making is akin to a race where each of the two alternatives is trying to get to a stopping threshold. If I cross that stopping threshold, I stop and I choose that alternative. You follow? So let's say here, there might be, 10 alternatives. D stands for dimension or alternative, right? So just bear with me as I work through this problem. Okay, each attribute. So let's say these are two cars. So attribute one might be price. And for me, price is my most important attribute. That's why I gave it a weight of 0.3. So alternative A scores a 4 and an 8. So that's a difference of 4. 4 times 0.3, that means it's 1.2 in favor of B so far. But I'm not going to stop. Why? Because for me to stop, I need to reach a differentiation level of 2.5. Okay. Again, think of it as I am trying to collect enough data that I no longer need to acquire more data. I'm convinced. Now, this is contrary to the classical economic postulate, which says that if you want to try to maximize utility, you should look at all of the available information. Because what better way to protect myself against the possibility of not choosing my utility maximization alternative than to look at everything? But of course, we don't do that, right? For almost no decision that anybody in this room has ever done, have you looked at all of the available information before you made a choice. Rather, at some point you stopped and the decision materialized itself. I'm now ready to choose, candidate A. I'm ready to marry this woman. I'm ready to buy this home. So here I go on. 9 minus 1 is 8. 8 times 0.25 is 2, but it was already the other way, 1.2. So 1.2 plus 2 gets me to 0.8. Then the next piece of information takes me to 1.8. And then the next piece of information, look, I cross the threshold at 2.55, which is greater than 2.5. And therefore, I stop and choose alternative A. So it only took me 4 attributes rather than the whole set for me to stop and choose A. So now I'm going to link this model, which was part of my, as I said, my doctoral dissertation, to this idea, and watch how I'm going to do it. You can argue that one threshold is the evidentiary threshold in support of an argument, and the other threshold is the evidentiary threshold for refutation. So when I'm building a nomological network, what am I doing? I'm saying, can I acquire enough information through all of this nomological network that puts me through the acceptance threshold? Now, the reason why I'm positioning it this way is because I'm hopefully convincing you that, contrary to the argument that evolutionary theorizing is just post hoc storytelling, it's the exact opposite of that. In other words, the evidentiary threshold that evolutionary psychologists use in their research, if they're serious, rigorous scholars, is actually much higher than the evidentiary threshold of all of those who are otherwise attacking us. That's why it's so galling, because they're attacking you for exactly the opposite of what you do. Okay? All right. Now, if you remember here, a couple of minutes ago, I said, first I'm going to talk about this, then this. So now I'm going to come to this third one. And this, I remember in a 2005 paper, 1995 paper, David, who's here, had talked about these conciliant trees. And then a few years later, Ketelaar and Ellis also argued for these kinds of trees. Now, what do I mean here by a conciliant tree? First, some terminology. Conciliance is a term that was reinvigorated in our lexicon by E.O. Wilson, who recently passed away, the late Harvard entomologist. He wrote a book, which I highly recommend you all read it if you haven't. The title of the book is Conciliance, Unity of Knowledge. So what does conciliance mean? Physics is more conciliant than sociology. Not because sociologists are dumb and physicists are smart. It's because physicists operate within certain epistemological rules of what constitutes core knowledge that we agree on. Now, that knowledge could be provisional. What we thought was true 300 years ago has been revised. But we do operate under the premise that the periodic table is a way to organize the chemical world. There are no chemists who are for the periodic table and chemists who are against the periodic table. We all agree there is such a thing as that particular element with that particular atomic structure. There is no such thing in the social science. Our bifurcation can start from the get-go. I say that biology matters, you say that it doesn't. We're now operating in different worlds. And here we go into la-la land, right? Biology doesn't matter when it comes to your sex. As a matter of fact, by the way, this is an incredible fortuitous situation, because even though I use evolutionary biology, I'm not a biologist by official training, and yet by magic, I was able to assort with a person who turned out to be a woman with whom I could have children, despite the fact that I'm not a biologist. So I didn't have the imprimatur to know that she was a woman. Through the happenstance of life, it turned out that our mating worked out. But as the noble justice who's about to go on the court to explain to us, she can't answer that question. She's just not equipped. She's not a biologist. That's what happens to the bifurcation of the intellectual landscape when you don't have a commitment to building coherent trees. Now, what is a coherent tree? A coherent tree, now I did it here, I built it for the research that I've done, so that you can go from the supra mechanism down to middle level theories, down to general mechanisms, down to a specific hypothesis tested in paper X. And I could have built this for my entire career. I'm just going to give you a few. Okay, so this has been tested in 73 trillion different ways across time, across animals. So general evolutionary theory, there's something called natural selection, there is sexual selection, there's inclusive fitness theory. These have all been tested in a million ways. So if you'd like, in a sense, we've already built the nomological networks to demonstrate their veracity. Now, let's say from these fundamental theories, we can have second layer theories. For example, parental investment theory is the theory that explains the distribution of sexual differences across species. It comes from Robert Trivers, who basically argued that if you want to know the pattern of sex differences across species, simply look at the minimal obligatory parental investment of each of the two sexes. In most species, women have much greater minimal obligatory parental investment. So then you expect them to be smaller. You expect them to be more sexually choosy. You expect them to have lesser testosterone. You expect them to be lesser risk takers. And if you want to test this theory well, then you look for species where you have what's called sexual reversal, where it is the males in that, the males in that species that have the greater minimal parental obligatory investment. And what do you think happens to every single one of the sex differences? They're perfectly reversed. It typically happens to species where there's external fertilization or external gestation, bird species, fish species. Everything is reversed. That's putting a bit of a kink to the, it's all due to the patriarchy. Because with one elegant theory, I'm able to explain the pattern of sex differences across 2 million sexually reproducing species. That doesn't smell like it's post hoc storytelling to me. It sounds like a lot more rigorous than any bullshit that most social scientists have ever published. But apparently, no, we just sip cognac. It's just BS, all this evolution stuff.
I do have a question. So this may not be very well formulated because I'm choking on my feet.
Let's wait. Let's ask for a question.
Oh, yeah, it's good.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just came in late.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll just do one, let's say. I won't go through all. So from this general mechanism, there's a thing called kin selection. You know, it explains altruism towards one's kin. Why would anybody ever take risks to save their kin? If all I cared about is that I protect my chance of survival, I would never engage in such behavior. Okay, I won't get into the whole details. Based on kin selection, I could then argue that the pattern of investments, of kin investments, are going to depend on two different metrics. Genetic relatedness between parties A and B, but a second, also very important point, genetic assuredness. Now, let me show you how I apply this in a very pointed way in the JCP paper. Okay, so if I want to look at patterns of gift giving, so this is using actual data from Israeli weddings, where my co-author, my lead co-author, Sigal Tiferet, had collected data from 30 weddings of the patterns of gifts that every wedding guest gave to the bride and to the grooms. Okay, so two things we tested. Number one, does the size of the gift vary as a function of the genetic relatedness between the recipient and the giver? And so just to kind of put it in a calculus, you know, you and your identical twin share all your genes. You and your dizygotic twin, it's like a sibling, 0.5. You and your children, 0.5, right? On average, I share half my gene. Me and my nieces or my uncles, 0.25. My grandparents, 0.25. So we could take the genetic relatedness, and then we can see if the pattern of gift matches that calculus, and it does. Now, I could have said probably most of you intuitively could have predicted this, even though you didn't know all the fancy stuff, but you could have known that I give bigger gift to my close brother than to my second cousin without all the fancy language. But the second hypothesis, you couldn't have generated it where you're not coming from an evolutionary perspective. You and your 4 grandparents are the same genetic relatedness, 0.25. But your maternal grandmother has 0 parental uncertainty. There is no such thing as maternity uncertainty. Your paternal grandfather has 2 generations of paternity uncertainty. So we expect the maternal grandmother to invest the most in her children, the paternal grandfather to invest the least, and the 2 other parents in between. Well, that study this is called differential grandparental solicitude. It's been tested in 17,000 different ways using completely different dependent measures, and it's been shown to be true. So we came along, took that principle, and said, we're going to apply it to our Israeli gift giving. How are we going to do that? Even in the context of the Middle East, patriarchal society, the matrilineal line of the bride and groom will receive much larger gifts for any given level of genetic relationship. And voila, that's exactly what we got. You would have never predicted this. You wouldn't have been able to formulate that hypothesis if you didn't come from an evolutionary perspective. So one of the things that evolutionary theory does is it allows us to identify research questions and hypotheses that would have heretofore been invisible to us. Okay? And so I start with a general principle, I go to the next mechanism, I go to the next lower mechanism, I get to a specific hypothesis. So there is nothing chaotic, epistemologically chaotic in what I'm saying, right? I can exactly trace the trajectory of how I arrived at this hypothesis. Imagine if every single paper that's published in JCR and the rest of it had that kind of elegance. We would have very different field. And this doesn't mean that everything that we do in consumer behavior is nonsense. Of course, there are incredibly brilliant people doing work, but imagine how much better it would be if we had the organizing framework of evolution. There is no other game in town. There is no other way to organize human behavior under anything other than evolution. And I mean, for some of you are not aware of this, but again, to point to David, you have here amongst you one of the pioneers of the whole field of evolutionary psychology, if not one of the top living psychologists in the world. So, there will be a day when nothing that I just said would be controversial to anybody. And you just have to be confident enough to just do the hard work so that people come around. So I'm almost done, not quite, but let me just, how am I doing in time? Yeah, I'm okay. So I'll probably be done in about 10 minutes. So what are some theoretical, epistemological, and methodological benefits that come from evolutionary psychology? And by the way, you can be in this room and you're an economist and you should hopefully be inspired. And you could be a political scientist and you could be inspired. And you could be a marketing scholar and you should be, because evolutionary theory is a explanatory key that traverses all landscapes, right? It's not only restricted for this field. Anywhere where biological beings reside is where evolutionary theory goes, right? There is nothing that's outside of its purview. Okay? So, as I mentioned earlier, evolutionary psychology grants us more complete explanations by recognizing that there are 2 epistemological levels at which we can tackle things, proximate and ultimate. It also allows us, as I just mentioned 2 minutes ago, allows us to generate novel hypotheses and research questions that would have otherwise remained invisible to us. The analogy I like to draw here is there are phenomena that you couldn't have studied if you were a chemist without the advent of the electronic microscope. There are phenomena that as a cosmologist, you can't study if you don't have a telescope that's sufficiently powerful to allow me to see certain phenomena. But this is actually much bigger than just a methodological breakthrough. It's an epistemological breakthrough. It is opening up research questions that would have been completely invisible to me, not because I'm dumb, but because I wouldn't have known how to think along those lines. This third one is a bit, let me just explain it very quickly. So evolutionary psychology grants me heuristic value in rejecting a priori hypotheses that do not adhere to evolutionary principles. What does that mean? Let's suppose you propose a hypothesis right now. I could save tons of taxpayer money and tons of time for you to spend researching this by telling you that I am guaranteed that your hypothesis will fail because it violates fundamental evolutionary principles. So let me give you an example of that. There is something in consumer behavior called the selectivity hypothesis, which basically says that across all domains, women are more comprehensive processors of information than men. When I read that, Jones, Mayers, Levy, and all the rest of the bullshit, I said to myself, that's nonsense. It can't be. There couldn't be a reason why evolution would have endowed women to be more comprehensive information processors across every possible domain. Rather, I would expect the following. There are some domains where men will be greater comprehensive processors, other domains where women will be, and others where there'll be no differences. And here is the mechanism that will explain it. It's called evolutionary theory. So for example, when it comes to mate search, when women reject mates, they do it more quickly. In other words, and actually it's a study that I published in 2009 in the journal Behavioral Decision Making. When it comes to rejection data, women acquire less information before they reject the suitors. In other words, it takes less information to convince women to reject all possible suitors. When it comes to choosing a suitor, women will acquire more information before they commit to a suitor. So within the same domain, I can get women to either search for more information or less, depending on whether I'm looking at their rejection data or acceptance data. So therefore, I could have said that that selectivity hypothesis, which has been 25,000 different studies, and now all of it's been falsified, I could have saved people all that trouble by simply telling you there is no way that that hypothesis could hold true. It's like saying, try to test something that violates gravity. I don't need to test it. I know already gravity exists. Okay? Of course, as I mentioned earlier, evolutionary psychology grants me greater consilience, greater unity of knowledge. It grants me greater methodological pluralism. Why? Just building those nomological networks requires for me to go to ancient Greece and different cultures and different paradigms. So I am much more open to the multiplicity of methodological paradigms. I'm not a priming guy. I'm not an affect guy. I am a anything guy, because I want to build the strongest, tightest argument. And then it, of course, allows greater interdisciplinarity. I gave a talk once at a university in Southern California that was very keen on hiring me. And then they came to me and they said the thing that served as the problem for why they didn't hire me, although there were other reasons involved with my public engagement, but the scientific reason was that I've published in too many disciplines, and that worked against me. So university puts as its mission statement, we are highly committed to interdisciplinarity, except if somebody actually does interdisciplinarity, in which case we hold it against them because they should have been very narrow, doing bullshit stuff on one topic for the next 40 years that nobody will read. But if I publish in medicine and in economics and in politics and in marketing and in consumer behavior, I look frazzled, I'm chaotic, I'm not serious. I don't only publish in JCR. It's too bad, guy, because you seem like you could have had a future. Shit, okay, too bad. Okay. An ethos of conceptual replications. Replications come in two types. Direct replication. I literally take your study and I exactly replicate it using the exact same stimulus, same dependent measure. Conceptual replication is where I try to replicate your finding using another method, right? I want to demonstrate that facial symmetry is a marker of beauty. There are many ways I can do that. But the bottom line is I want to demonstrate that facial symmetry is a marker of beauty. And therefore, those nomological networks that I showed you are exactly conceptual replications across time and place. And then finally, something that now has become a bit more known, it comes from a brilliant paper in behavioral and brain sciences from Joe Henrich et al. You should all read it, by the way, irrespective of your field. This is where they first introduced the idea of weird. The weird bias is when you run studies based on convenience samples using Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which is most of us run studies using convenience samples with our undergrads. Now, in many cases, that's perfectly fine. But if you're trying to make an argument about a human universal, then you've got to get beyond that. So this again proves to you that contrary to the usual attack that evolutionary psychologists engage in just so storytelling, they do the exact opposite. Because evolutionary psychologists do go to the Hudson tribe. They do go to the Negev Bedouin. They do go to Chilean Andes mountain or the Yanomamo tribe to demonstrate that something is a universal. So the protection against the weird bias, again, is greatly assuaged via evolutionary psychology. Okay, a few more quick quotes. This is one of our common friends, David and I, Douglas Kenrick, another pioneer of evolutionary psychology at Arizona State. So this is what they had written in it for social psychology, which of course, I hope you all have the answer to it now. Why are the mini theories in one chapter of a social psychology text often discontinuous with mini theories presented in other chapters? Why does such an important field in the social and behavioral sciences, one that studies so many significant topics that are vital to understanding human behavior, not have a meta theory, one capable of tying different research areas and disparate findings together? Well, the meta theory, we have it. It's called evolutionary theory. That is the meta theory, right? So one day in the future, whether you are a political scientist or an economist or a consumer psychologist, or a game theorist, there'll be no one who says, I am in the anti-evolution camp. It'll just be it. There is no other game in town. And sometimes when I speak this way, because I'm a passionate guy, people think I'm being dogmatic or apostolic. I'm not at all. It actually comes from the indignation of spending 30 years repeating the same stuff to people who go, la, 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 evolution, it's a bunch of nonsense. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. I won't go through this one, but basically what this one is saying is exactly that we're very good at building bricks that adhere to statistical significant tests. Oh, here's the effect size, here's the p-value, but there is no architect of the building of that wall. Again, the architect is called evolution. I'm almost done, skip this one. Now here, I just want to show you something about interdisciplinarity. I straddle two worlds, the natural sciences and the social sciences, and I'm housed in a business school. So I go to conferences where you have both types of folks. When I go to the premier conference of Human Behavior and Evolutionary Society, which regrettably I haven't been to in many years, if you look at the people who attend the conference by looking at their departmental affiliation, every single possible topic is covered. You have people from English literature who are at the evolution conference. Why? Because they're applying Darwinian lens to study literary narratives. You have medical people, you have engineering people doing evolutionary computation, you have behavioral scientist types, you have political science, you have feminists who are in the room. When you go to the premier consumer research conference, it's only marketing folks. Why? We should be right at the forefront of everything in human phenomena. I mean, it's literally, I consume, therefore I am. Short of breathing, we are consuming now knowledge in this room. So why aren't there engineers at our conferences? Why aren't there clinical psychologists at our conference? Many dark side consumption acts come from clinical pathologies. Why aren't they at our conference? Because we're very siloed, we're very insular. And again, I spent 30 years screaming this, but I don't play the game of the JCR and so on, and so I lose interest in playing that game. But it's insane. Something as important as studying consumption should not be restricted to one group of people in one silo in the business school. All right, next. I'm almost done, so bear with me. This is E.O. Wilson. This is on the Charlie Rose show before he got mired in the #MeToo stuff. He used to have a highbrow show on PBS late at night where he would bring a one-on-one guest. So he had E.O. Wilson, who's the Harvard biologist who recently passed away, and James Watson, who's the Nobel Prize winner, co-discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA. And so let me just read you these quotes, because I mean, basically at the end of my courses, when I teach, I put up this quote. It basically covers my course and any course I teach. So psychologists, most of the practicing psychologists and theoretical psychologists, and the vast majority of social scientists who really determine a lot of the intellect that goes into our policies, and our philosophies have no connection at all to their true nature of humanity or what human nature is at a biological level. This is still a huge gap. And I believe that we will start to fill that in a way that will be useful in years immediately ahead. And then James Watson retorts, I see the past century was the coming together of chemistry and biology. This century will be the coming together of psychology and biology. And then Charlie Rose just says, wow, the coming together of psychology and biology. That's what I've been doing my entire career. David Buss has been doing it for 15, 20 years before me. There is no other game in town. You can't study human behavior devoid of biology. I'll skip this one. Out. This is arguably my favorite quote of all time, from all scientists. It's from J.B.S. Haldane, who was a famous evolutionary geneticist, but who was also very quotable. He had great quips. And so this one basically talks about the 4 stages that scientists go through before they accept something. Stage 1, this is worthless nonsense, bullshit. You're an idiot. Then when more data comes in, well, sure, this is an interesting but perverse point of view. When more data comes in, well, this is true, but quite unimportant. I mean, who cares really? What are the practical implications of studying evolutionary psychology in business school? You're a moron. And then when the defensive wall capitulates, oh, I always said so. I've always been your biggest fan. Now, here's the problem for a lot of the folks who email me. I am an electronic email hoarder, meaning I still have your emails from 1995 when I was the biggest moron. And I kept it with the email in 2022 when it was, we'd be very honored to have you as our plenary speaker. So it's quite extraordinary that I went from arguably the biggest moron to have ever graced the face of the world to being the esteemed. Now I say this not to be obnoxious and gleeful, but rather to let you know that if you're an honest academic, you put your head down, science is autocorrective, you believe in what you're saying, eventually people will come around. And that's what's happening now. And again, it's not to be haughty or gleeful. It comes, of course, in part from frustration, because for many, many years, the paper was desk rejected because, evolution, but now it's, hey, we'd love to have you write a invited piece. And I mean, again, no one could probably speak to that better than David does. So to engage in some shameless, shameful plugging, Dobzhansky famously said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And of course, I say nothing in consumer behavior, in business, in any kind of behavior makes sense except in the light of evolution. Tonight, I'll be talking about another one of my books, The Parasitic Mind, but these are some of the books that I've written that deal with evolutionary psychology as related to the business school. Thank you very much. Shall I start with you? No, one was the end of my talk. Then
I had down compared to one. Okay, so this is very interesting for me. Is there a dinner I can come to?
Yes,
Okay.
tonight, 7 p.m.
7 p.m. Okay, I'll try and make it.
Or Wednesday night.
Thank you, God.
Okay, thank you. So you'll ask me the question.
I think I have to go now because I have an appointment at 1:30.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Cheers.
I have a question on the, go ahead. The networks, or the nomological networks. Nothing stops somebody in the social sciences from engaging in the same type of process. I guess when you put the tree, what do you call the tree?
The conciliant tree.
Conciliant tree in the end, right? That I agree with you. There's no root node in any other social science if you don't approach from biology, because there's no gravity. Some economists in the room might say, well, there are a couple of things, maybe there are axioms that we can not really, right? But the nomological part, there's nothing that stops, and perhaps there should be more discipline on, and I say that discipline, not just not different disciplines, but like more discipline in trying to look at a question from different lenses. Is that fair to say?
You're saying that there is nothing that stops social scientists from being committed to building those nomological networks? Yes, but they're not epistemologically built to do that. So, for example,
they're not trained in that discipline,
and they're not trained to think using that tool, right? They're very siloed, and what happens? So sociology generates a lot of nonsense, not because sociology is not a serious science. As a matter of fact, Auguste Comte, several hundred years ago, argued that in the hierarchies of sciences, sociology should be at the top because it's a lot harder to study social systems involving human beings than to study the structure of a molecule, right? The problem is that sociology has not adhered to the scientific method. It has allowed itself, to talk about something that I'll discuss tonight, to be parasitized by ideology. Therefore, it is not committed to the scientific method, one element of which is to be committed to the truth as per the nomological network. So there's nothing stopping sociologists from doing these trees. What stops them is their parasitized minds. Yes?
So I would recommend adding one more quote. Joe Rogan in one of his stand-up bits said, maybe God created a monkey that doesn't like to think it's a monkey and lies a lot. And so maybe I should wait until your talk tonight, because it seems to me the real reason why there's just so much push against the evolutionary framework is because, I mean, science has always been a fight over a turf, but this is going to be a tough turf to give up, because the evolutionary framework implies an understanding that potentially means that you're going to put so many people out of business. Not only within just the academic community, but also talk about medicine. It's so much easier and it makes a lot more money for you to keep, cosmetically fix symptoms rather than actually to go to the core of the problem and tackle that.
Yes.
And sometimes you can't tackle it. It's an is. But we have a problem with the normative judgment, and the normative judgment implies that we can't be monkeys. There must be something we can do about it, and it's much easier to do that rather than to admit the fact.
Yeah. So, in line with what you're saying, I've often sort of worried that all the battles that someone like David or myself or the next generation will always have to keep fighting the same battles because the phoenix always rises. I might have even asked David, do you think we will ever, deal a fatal blow epistemologically to the detractors? And I think I'm starting to think along your lines, which is it's an inherent part of the human makeup to build cognitive and emotional obstacles to believing evolutionary theory. In other words, we were really caught in a difficult situation whereby, so here I'll draw an analogy. Richard Dawkins talks about middle world. Middle world means that our brains are not made to understand phenomena intuitively at the nano level. And our brains are not made to understand phenomena at the cosmological level. So once you leave the middle world where our brains have evolved to see things at that scale, we start getting screwed. We don't understand it, right? That's why quantum physics is hard to understand, right? And so along a similar analogy, I think there'll always be someone standing here fighting against a group of folks who say that evolution sucks and is BS. I agree with you. David?
Yeah, so the anecdote and the question.
Sure.
So on the ultimate approximate thing, and I think that's one of these issues where you keep asking the why question. But I remember teaching a graduate class a while back, and there was this one graduate student who just could not get the ultimate approximate. I was using the example that you use as sex difference in height. And so finally in frustration, I said, why do you think men are taller than women? And he thought for a minute, he said, because they have longer bones. You just could not get the ultimate. So my question for you though is that some people, when they seem to be able to get it, and others, when exposed to the same information, just can't quite. But again, I was wondering if in your experience you have thoughts about, what individual differences make some people more receptive?
I love that question.
Receptive or cognitively capable, not. I don't have.
So I have a student right now who's writing his thesis under my supervision. We're hoping to address exactly the question you said. What is it that causes people to either be receptive to the idea once presented with the evidence versus those who are so parasitized for whatever reason that no matter what I say, it's la la la. So I don't have. I mean, we can speculate if you want here, but I don't have an answer for that. Do you have any ideas?
I don't, but I look forward to the results of the study.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
More so just to add on to that, do you think that neurodiversity may have anything to do with that? That like having a different brain type means you receive information in different ways than people?
But what's the metric of neurodiversity that would manifest itself here? Like, can you give me more specifics?
So, for example, like someone with autism has a more systemizing brain. They understand things more in terms of logic than they do in terms of emotion. So, and then someone who's more empathizing or has more empathizing brain. This is the work that I think I just read a book by Simon Baron Cohen on this. And someone with more empathizing brain is not going to listen to logic as well. So something like that, like the difference in empathy and systemizing capacity in your brain, you think that would have something to do with it?
Certainly sounds reasonable to me. I mean, much of the stuff that I'm planning to do with the student in question really deals with, so for example, if you are a social constructivist who believes in the hopeful message of social constructivism is basically, we're all born tabula rasa. Actually, it's one of the idea pathogens that I'll be speaking about tonight, parasitic mind. We're all born tabula rasa, and it's only the nefarious forces of socialization that lead us to be who we are. So Michael Jordan only became an NBA all-time great more than I did, not because he had any starting points that would have led him to be better than me. That would be Nazism to say that. It's because his mother hugged him enough or didn't hug him enough that made him be able to jump higher than me. So social constructivist philosophy, the tabula rasa, if I believe that, if I internalize that as a fundamental belief of how the world is, I'm just less likely to accept evolutionary theory because it seems to go against it. So that's really, so we're not looking at things like neurodiversity, archetypes, but certainly that seems feasible to me. Richard.
I'm not sure how well I can pose this, but since you brought up Henrik, I wanted to ask, so his more recent book on The Secret of Our Success,
Yeah.
makes what it struck me as a very strong argument that one of the things that we've evolved to more than almost anything else is this sort of cultural limitation stories. Does this, is that
Cultural limitation?
imitation? Basically, and my takeaway from that was like almost any behavior that happens to get associated and gets copied can end up being like common in a culture, even if it doesn't happen. And I have to think, does this create a problem with it? Does this jam the ability to apply evolutionary psychology? I mean, it obviously, does it make it harder to build the network of evidence?
So there are a couple of ways I can answer this. One way is as relating to cultural forms. So when you study the evolutionary roots of a cultural form, you could either make an adaptive argument for why that exists, or you could argue that it's an exaptation. So for example, take religion. Exaptation basically means it's a byproduct of evolution. So the color of our skeletal system need not have evolved to be that because it's an adaptation. It's a path-dependent thing. It's a byproduct, okay? So take religion. Some evolutionary theorists argue that religion is itself an adaptation. So the classic example is David Sloan Wilson, who, using a group selectionist argument, argues that if you have a religious group and a less religious group, religiosity grants that group greater communality, greater cohesion, greater internal cooperation. So therefore, via the virtue of being more religious, it confers adaptive advantage to the religious group over the non-religious group. So that would be an adaptive argument. An exaptive argument would be that no, religion did not evolve because it specifically itself is an adaptation, but it's piggybacking on other systems. So for example, we already have evolved tribal thinking, us versus them, blue team, red team, right? There's us, the 150, and there's all the other assholes, okay? Well, religion piggybacks on that, right? Because take, for example, all the Abrahamic religions. There's the Jews and the Gentiles. There is the believers and the kuffar, the non-believers. There is us who believe in Jesus and are going to be, salvation, and the rest of you who are going to burn in hell. So all the religions piggyback on the mechanism of coalitional thinking. So that's the first point I would say. The second point is that oftentimes people think that all phenomena are either due to evolution, genes, or culture. Whereas the correct way to view it is that culture itself is due to evolution. And the classic example that I like to use, this is not my own research, but from actually a guy from my alma mater and some of his students and so on, Darwinian gastronomy, okay? So now you might say, what is Darwinian gastronomy? Gastronomy is cuisine. Well, let's suppose I want to study the pattern of spice use around the world in different cuisines, okay? If I were a cultural anthropologist or a cultural psychologist, where would my research stop? The Mexicans eat more spicy food than the Swedes. Good night, everybody. I never got to the final ultimate causation. Why is it that some cultures have evolved to have spicy food, while others have evolved to have non-spicy food. And it turns out that it is a cultural adaptation to a very real biological problem, which is in hotter climates, ambient temperature, you have a greater amount of foodborne pathogens and a greater proliferation of foodborne pathogens. Therefore, this is the antimicrobial hypothesis. Therefore, cuisines become a cultural adaptation to a biological problem. So all this to say is that I generally agree with Henrik in that he is one of the guys who is trying to incorporate cultural imitation, cultural transmission under the evolutionary framework. I don't know if I've answered you, but.
Let me be
No.
Go ahead.
Yeah, a short question, and I'm sure very naive, but nonetheless, I like Porsche, and I've always tried to drive a Porsche or a Porsche equivalent. So I get it, you know, I'm like that example, so I thought that's great. And yet I know some people, and I'll say some guys, who seem not to care at all about the car they drive.
Yes.
And so it
Why?
seems like, yeah, why?
So, great question. Great, sorry.
Low T, no, sorry.
Lower T. Lower T. So here, there is a universal mechanism for us to signal status. The means by which each of us will signal status will vary depending on our individual laws, right? So for example, men in all cultures will seek to obtain status. In one culture, it's by me having the most cattle heads. In another culture, it's me having an Ivy League degree. In another culture, it's me having the souped up Porsche. But what is common to all these is that in no culture does the woman say, no, what I'd really like is an apathetic, pear-shaped, nasal voiced loser who plays in the basement video games all day. That drives me into a sexual frenzy. Where's that guy? So in other words, by the way, this is, you know. So this is why, by the way, evolutionary psychology, I didn't put up this canard, but one of the arguments for evolutionary psychology is, oh, it's biologically deterministic. That's bullshit. Because even genes get turned on or off as a function of environmental input. Okay, so what is deterministic is that males are going to seek status. What is not deterministic is the individual paths by which we instantiate that goal. So therefore, there's always room for behavioral plasticity, whether it be at the cultural level or at the individual level. So you decide that you want to do it by the Porsche. I decide to do it by having the greatest collection of antique books to impress the date that I'm with. So, but we both want to show status.
And hence the need for the molecular network as well, right? Because that's something you can investigate in different
Exactly right.
cultural or different environments and see, okay, what is status in that environment? Does that still relate to the level?
Exactly. Different cultures, different time periods. You know, can I go back across time, across all recorded history, and find a culture where women were more likely to desire handsome guys more than their status? Well, David Buss has already done all those studies, right? In 1989, the classic study was with how many cultures were there?
37.
37, right? So imagine telling a guy who went through the painstaking task of collecting data from 37 culture, when the person who's levying that attack ran every single study that they've ever published using 30 undergrads from their undergrad class. He's the real scientist, but he's the bullshitter. I mean, it's insane.
So the question, do you have any folks in the social sciences that you admire in the sense that, okay, the work they do to some degree, even though they might not be grounded on the level of dogma or axioms that are proven truth by 17 million studies, right?
Who are not evolutionists.
Yeah, not evolution, not starting evolution, but they engage in the sort of epistemological search for the truth to their study that mimics to some extent what this framework that you're here today have.
Yeah, fantastic question. So all the people from my original doctoral training, so I was trained in the behavioral decision making. So the Amos Tversky, Daniel Kahneman, my doctoral supervisor, Richard Taylor, who won the Nobel Prize, who was also my professor, Herb Simon. So all those guys are phenomenal scientists whom I highly respect and revere and admire. But I was always frustrated, hence my evolutionary itch, because what they focused on is this mythical creature called Homo economicus. And we're going to spend our entire career showing that Homo economicus is wrong, right? So let me show you another study demonstrating that we're not Homo economicus. And being who I am, I said, I'm starting to find this boring, right? I want to understand why the architecture of the human mind when it comes to decision making is the way that it is. And that's why I made the theory, I shifted off into evolutionary theory. But I was very much trained in the Thaler stuff. But notwithstanding that they weren't evolutionists, I could only but admire them. I mean, they're phenomenal thinkers. And as we were talking with Richard earlier, some of the brightest people I've ever interacted with.
The reason I asked, I wanted to mention Thomas Sowell as someone that I think he engages in phenomenal work in his way to do these nonological networks. And looking for, okay, incentives matter. Well, let's look at a million different cultures and a million different situations across time and try to show you that, you know.
Thomas Sowell is the OG of anti-woke people, right? Before I came along to do my anti-woke stuff when I was in diapers, he was smacking around the idiots in the 1960s on television. So I'm all with you on Thomas Sowell.
I'm always reading one of his books. So right now I'm reading one that is going through like all this cultures and calling it.
He's doing nomological networks without calling it nomological networks.
Exactly. That's why.
Did you have a question?
So since you mentioned the 150 us against them, what do you think of Robin Dunbar's work?
Oh, yes. So for those of you who don't know, Robin Dunbar is an evolutionary anthropologist who proposed what's called now Dunbar's number, which is 150. The idea being that we've evolved to live in bands of up to 150. So you can demonstrate that many things in society operate optimally at 150. The optimal military division, no more than 150. The optimal business division, no more than 150. How many Christmas cards we give to people, no more than 150. How many people at weddings typically average 150. Actually, I gave a talk, actually 2 talks at Indiana University many years ago. I met at one point the lab of a social psychologist who was doing studies on the network size early on with Facebook. So this is maybe 15 years ago. And I asked him, I said, do you have data on the size of the networks, of friendship networks? He goes, yes. I said, don't tell me what it is. Can I predict what the number is? So he looked at me like, why would you know what the number is? I said, is it 150? And he looked at me as though I was, a prophet. And then I explained Dunbar's number. So, I mean, what do I think of it? It certainly seems to have been empirically validated across many settings. Are you asking that question because you have a criticism of it?
No, I actually like Robin Dunbar a lot. And there is, his hypothesis of the gossip. I wonder what you think about it, because like the evolutionists are split on this question. Some of them like the gossip hypothesis, some of them don't.
So I haven't followed that literature too well, but they're both arguing that there is an adaptive reason for gossip, but different reasons?
No, so Robin Dunbar talks about, like even everything is, for him, is the group size, right? Everything is less explanatory variable. And he talks about even the evolution of language as a function of group size as well. Some people, like for example, Robert Boyd says he's right, the Dunbar number, it's like he's empirically validated. But he doesn't agree that potentially it's the way people maintain bonding is through this mechanism of gossip. Maybe there's some alternative mechanism.
Right. So I can't speak to that debate, but what I can generally speak to is in my first book, I talk about what are so not by group size, but just what are the themes that people gossip about? And that is perfectly predicted from evolutionary theory. So that, we gossip about the things that are juiciest from an evolutionary perspective to be transferring information on the others, right? So did you hear the neighbor? She's cheating on her husband. Well, that's paternity uncertainty, right? That's juicy, that's viral. I really want to get home to tell my wife about it. But I don't want to tell, hey, did you find out she did poorly on her physics exam? Nobody cares about that, right? So the things that we love to gossip most about are perfectly predicted from evolutionary theory, but I'd have to look into the group sizes. I don't know that stuff. Yes, sir.
Is there an evolutionary psychology reason why the university would have STEM sciences sort of allow them to propagate with periodic table of elements or loop gravity or anything like that. And social sciences turns into a Tower of Babel. What is behind?
Yes, great question. So that question is really, I mean, I'll answer it here, but tonight's talk is very much along those lines. So I'm going to rephrase what you just asked using the language of tonight's talk, the parasitic mind. Why are some fields inherently more where the idea pathogens proliferate more than in other fields? And I think the reason is a function of how coupled they are to reality. Reality has a good way to serve as a feedback loop to how much bullshit you're doing, right? So engineering school, business school is less likely to be parasitized by idea pathogens because I can test the ideas in real time, right? I can't build a bridge using postmodernist physics because it will collapse. I can't build an economic model of consumer choice using postmodernist mathematics because it won't predict anything. So some fields inherently, because they're coupled to reality, have some inoculation against some of the nonsense that you referred to. Other fields, you know, in the humanities and in the rest of the social sciences, they're perfectly free of any consequences of their BS. And so therefore, they espouse all this nonsense. Tonight, I'll talk about postmodernism, and I'll talk about how it is the granddaddy of all idea pathogens, right? It is precisely what has allowed someone like the person who's going to be appointed to be sitting on the Supreme Court to say, in all seriousness, I'm unable, because I'm not a biologist, to define what is a woman. It's postmodernism that has granted her the epistemological trajectory to be able to say that without cracking a smile.
But do you have an answer for why, for the mechanisms in place that allow that to grow? So, well, I ask the question always to people that run, you know, either the business school or the university, like, how do you decide the allocation of how many marketing professors to finance ratio? What is the ratio? Or you can ask that within the business school, or you can ask that how many business school professors versus history professors. How do you define the ratio? And I never heard an answer. And nobody has an answer. Well, one dies, we hire another one. It's kind of like what the answer is, right? So that perpetuated the availability of those jobs and so on in areas that might not be producing actually any knowledge back to reality. But why do we allow it to happen?
Yeah. So, and I talk about that in the parasitic mind using the framework of operations research, where you try to maximize or minimize something. But let me try to answer it briefly so I don't give up too much tonight.
You don't have to. It's okay.
No, I'll just very, very quickly. Look, I have nothing against studying Shakespeare. So people think that when I come in, you should only study math or consumer modeling or neuroscience. Otherwise, no. There is great room for studying art history, but it always has to be wedded to an epistemology of truth. If it's not the scientific method, it still has to be based on reason. It can't be based on intellectual terrorism, right? That's where I would draw. So I can't talk about allocation of how many professors, but once you are teaching generations of students that there is not a single universal truth, and all truths are suspect by virtue of the fact that everything is relative and we are bound and shackled by our subjective biases, that's a Darwinian dead end. You can't grow from that. You can't interact with postmodernism and come out a more intellectually enriched person. It's nihilism. So to me, on those grounds, I would say there is no room for postmodernist professors because they're intellectual terrorists.
On that note, hope to see you tonight at 5 p.m. in Rolling Hall.
Thank you, guys.